I wound up doing 2 Yizkor sermons this season. On Yom Kippur, I spoke about my paternal grandfather. And today I want to share one story about my paternal grandmother. Her name was Sylvia. And she was an ardent socialist. Her Judaism was Yiddish and Abishering and hosting a good meal. Now, she married my nominally religious grandfather, and she yielded to his request that they send their sons to some kind of a Hebrew school. One day, my father came home from that Orthodox Sunday school and found his mom in the kitchen. He had a report to share from his teacher. "We're supposed to keep kosher, you know." My mom, his mom, my grandmother, leaned down in the kitchen and said in no uncertain terms, "Over my dead body." Neither of my parents imagined that they'd keep a kosher home. They also probably didn't plan on having a kid who would become a rabbi or a cantor or both. When I got married and my parents began to imagine the next stage of their own lives, they hoped and prayed that would include grandparenting. And they worried, as I know is the case for plenty of parents whose kids become religious, that there was a chance that my children, their grandchildren, would be told that they weren't free to eat in their grandparents' kitchen. They didn't want to risk any version of that. So in a rather extraordinary act of grace and hope, they turned their entire kitchen over to kosher, meat and dairy. It was the start of an era when we've shared many meals from their kitchen, and I do make sure that my children know the lengths their grandparents went to be sure that they could spoil them rotten with food. So some years ago, my father went back to visit his own father in Syracuse. They went, as they often did, to visit relatives at the cemetery, including my grandmother. My dad asked his father to hang back a bit. "I want to speak to Mom alone for a little bit, okay?" My father walked over to my grandmother's grave and started talking, updating her as he liked to do on her life, on his life, on my life, on his grandkids, her great-grandchildren's lives. And then he added, "Oh, and Mom, remember how you said we'd keep a kosher kitchen over your dead body? Well..." When we're at our best, many of us do what we can to honor our elders while they're alive. This is especially true of parents. It's a cornerstone of Atzeret Hadibrot, Kibud Av V'Em, respecting our parents. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of sitting on a Beit Din with a candidate who was choosing Judaism after decades of marriage to a Jew. She shared that she'd known deep in her heart and soul that she would someday convert formally to Judaism, but not while her parents were still alive. She had been raised by 2 devout Catholics who loved their daughter and loved their Jewish son-in-law and their grandchildren who were being raised in a Jewish community. But they had shared many times with their daughter that they prayed that they would never have to witness her leave the church. Sitting before the panel of rabbis at her Beit Din, this woman shared emotionally that in the wake of her parents' deaths, each of them in the past 2 years, she felt at peace formalizing her own conversion. She said, "I had said everything I needed to say and done everything I needed to do for them in their lifetime. Now I have to live my life for me." Does the mitzvah of honoring one's parents extend past their lifetime? Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the first Chabad rabbi, wrote that some teachers, though not all, consider the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Em to be an obligation for the entire life of a child who is observing that mitzvah. After all, the mitzvah is the child's responsibility, and the notion of an ethical will of any sort is predicated on the idea that the serious desires of one generation get to live on as meaningful and weighty guidance for the next generation. But then again, when a life ends, a lot of things end. The phone calls you made on the commute home each night, seasonal shopping trips and travels together around the world, the sound of their joyful shouts when their home team makes it to the playoffs, their chocolate babka just the way that they like to make it. There is a season for reading in bed side by side each night, and a season for falling asleep alone, a time for evening strolls around the block, and a time to ask a friend if they'll join you on a run because you need company. A time for cleaning up after his mess, and a time when you miss that messy room. A time for conversation, and a time for silence. A time for wearing his dog tag with hope, and a time for taking it off when he's buried. Towards the end of the Torah, there is a prohibition that puts these seasons into stark relief, that there is a time to seek counsel in life and a time to let go of that counsel in death. Lo yimatzeh v'cha ma'avir beno uvito va'esh, kosem kesamim, me'onen u'menachesh u'mechashev. Don't let there be anyone found among you who consigns a child to the fire, who's an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer. V'chover chaver, v'shoel ov v'yidoni, v'doresh el hametim. One who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or the doresh el hametim, the one who inquires of the dead. This detailed list of prohibited consultations with the realm of the dead showcases the many ways in which people try desperately in every generation to cross that threshold. In every era of humanity and in every corner of the globe, people will arise to play a version of Whoopi Goldberg's character in Ghost, making promises that people can be in touch with their deceased loved ones. But the bookend of the second verse here underscores the most painful reality of all. What we cannot do under any circumstances is lidrosh el hametim, to seek counsel from someone who is no longer alive. There's a story in Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud in Sanhedrin, about Rabbi Akiva. When Rabbi Akiva would read this passage in the Torah, he would cry. He read the idea of this prohibition literally, not that we cannot consult with the dead, but rather that the rabbis forbade us from contacting and manipulating the dead, lest we be in contact with evil spirits. Rabbi Akiva would cry out, according to this Talmudic text, if we're not allowed to seek counsel from the dead in case we would successfully come into contact with evil spirits, well, how much more so should a person be allowed to inquire of the dead so that he can bring pure and good things upon himself? I picture a tearful Rabbi Akiva dedicated to Torah, a great teacher, but first a human being who knew from loss, who wept at the unfairness of mortality, a human who cried not because he thought it was possible to summon the dead, but because his heart would always want to try. What he would have given, what so many of us would give for one last conversation with a loved one, one chance to ask their opinion, to hear their voice, to receive their wisdom. The great voices of medieval commentary reinforce that this prohibition is meant to protect us against the predation of snake oil salesmen on the whims of emotional and vulnerable parties. The practices of necromancy and claims of seance holders, those are cruel promises that are impossible to keep. But the customs and laws of Judaism resist the idea that anything, even a life, really comes to an end. Not even the Torah, which we'll rewind tomorrow and start again. And it's not just a resistance to endings, but rather Judaism's eternal insistence that the best is yet to come. This optimism, which perhaps was born of the repetitive grief that our people have faced, bends the meaning of mortality. The sadness of one life coming to an end is inextricably bound up in the promise that something new, something is beginning. Perhaps the version of your life that is no longer lived for the sake of someone else, but for your sake and for the sake of your future. Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory wrote that we are the only people, Am Yisrael, who insist that the golden age has yet to come. It's in the future. We live with the promise that something good, maybe even something better, is always yet to come. Rereading the verse through this lens, the prohibition against lidrosh el hametim forbids us from making death the source of meaning. Necromancers are in the business of convincing people that the most important answers in life can be found by consulting magically with the ones who are no longer with us. Torah is in the business of turning us towards possibilities. What will our life be now that theirs is no longer? The utmost dignity that we can show towards loved ones we've lost is to insist that their life is worthy of a sequel, a next chapter in the book. As we stand in memory of loved ones at Yizkor, we have the precious opportunity to grace them with traces of that next chapter. Let your heart crack open at the notion that the time to hear their wisdom has passed, and then visit their souls, welcome them here, and regale them with stories of new beginnings. Tell them what you fixed and what you're dreaming of fixing. Tell them how hard these last 2 years have been and how joyful this holiday is. Tell them where you've been. Tell them where you dream of going, whom you've met, and how you dream of growing. Promise them you'll keep coming back because this isn't the end. There aren't really any ends after all. It's just the beginning. My grandmother passed away just before my bat mitzvah. More than 25 years later, her recipes, though, are still centerpieces at family holiday celebrations. At Pesach, we bake my grandmother's matzah farfel cookies. Now, I doubt that she imagined that she would have a granddaughter who would be a rabbi or a cantor or both. Nor do I think she would have imagined her great-grandchildren baking her recipes in her son's strictly kosher kitchen. But I know she would have appreciated our self-critique on each batch of cookies. Too many raisins, not enough cinnamon, never quite good enough, always room for improvement. The best cookies surely are yet to come.